In today's lecture, we are going to talk about seed plants and more specifically Gymnosperms, which are one of the two groups of seed plants. What you see in the background here are pine nuts, and pine nuts are here first because they're delicious, and second because it is one of the edible products we get from the Gymnosperms. We will start today's lecture by talking about what seeds are. They are a new trait that were not present in the ferns or lycophytes or other groups. And with seeds, we will see that the female gametophyte is now attached to and nutritionally dependent on the sporophyte. That's a huge change from the first terrestrial plants, in which case the situation was reversed. We'll look at that in some diagrams. We'll also see that the male gametophyte is now inside a hard protective coating, and those two things together give us pollen. And pollen is going to allow those male gametophytes to disperse and to reach the female gametophytes. After we talk about seeds generally, we'll talk about the Gymnosperms, which are cone plants, or plants with naked seeds. So gymnosperm literally means naked seed. And these are plants that make pollen cones and ovule cones. They have lateral growth and they do make true wood. There are a few different groups that we'll talk about. We will focus on the Cycads, Ginkgo, and the Conifers. This is a diagram or an illustration I've shown a few times of the algae, the charophytes that gave us terrestrial plants, and then the different groups of terrestrial plants. We had the three lineages of bryophytes, the liverworts, mosses, and hornworts, and then we had the lycopods and ferns, which had pretty similar traits. We are now up to the seed plants, which include the gymnosperms and angiosperms. And this is similar information, but shown on a phylogeny. Remember, this shows the relationships among the species. And remember that groups that are connected closer to the tip of this diagram, so up towards the top in this case, are more closely related than groups that connect further down. So based on that, we can see that the gymnosperms and angiosperms are closely related. In fact, on this phylogeny, they are one another's closest relatives. These two groups together are the only two groups that make seeds, and so we can call them the seed plants. The seed plants are going to complete our transition from the first terrestrial plants, which had a sporophyte that was dependent on the gametophyte, up to the point now where we have a gametophyte that is dependent on the sporophyte. To see that, let's go back through and review what each of these different plant groups does in terms of reproduction. So the charophytes aren't plants, they're algae, but they give us plants. Remember that the charophytes don't have a sporophyte generation at all. They make a zygote, but that zygote immediately goes through meiosis. So there's no multicellular diploid generation. The next three groups are the bryophytes, and in all of these cases, there is now a sporophyte. But remember, the sporophyte is always something that is relatively small, it's attached to the gametophyte, and it gets its nutrition mostly from the gametophyte rather than capturing it itself with photosynthesis. And so in all of these cases, the diploid generation, the sporophyte, relies on the gametophyte, and the gametophyte is really the dominant plant that you would probably encounter if you went out and looked at these. We talked about why that was a bad strategy, because we said that being haploid, having only one set of chromosomes in each cell, is a limitation. If those chromosomes get damaged, then the cell does not have any backup copy. Let's move on now and talk about what the next two groups did. Those were the lycophytes and the ferns. Remember that in each of these cases, there was a free-living gametophyte and a free-living sporophyte. So you're seeing this right now with your fern dishes. You have small gametophytes that are probably growing on the surface of your agar, and they don't look like much. They're sort of little green circles, but they are photosynthesizing on their own and acquiring their own nutrition. We will also see sporophytes grow up out of those gametophytes, and the sporophytes are going to be photosynthetic very quickly, and they are going to be gathering their own nutrition throughout their lives, and those are going to be the large ferns with well-developed fronds. So for both the lycophytes and ferns, both generations, the gametophyte and sporophyte, are acquiring their own nutrients. They're not dependent on each other. In both of these groups, the sporophyte is dominant. It's the big plant, and the gametophyte is the small plant. So that's a small transition from the bryophytes to the early vascular plants. Now if we move on to the next group, we see another difference. We've now switched to the point where the sporophyte is both the dominant generation and it is the one that provides nutrition to the gametophytes. The gametophytes in seed plants do not photosynthesize. They simply acquire nutrition from their parent sporophyte. So this is a big reversal if you compare what the seed plants are doing to what the bryophytes did. The words are backwards. Bryophytes, the sporophyte depended on the gametophyte. Seed plants, the gametophyte now depends on the sporophyte. Quite a reversal. This is important because the sporophytes, remember, are the ones with 2 copies of DNA in each of their cells. They're going to be the ones better able to deal with DNA damage. So I just mentioned this in the description on the last slide, but here's a slide that says it. So remember that gametophytes are haploid. They have 1 copy of chromosomes in each cell. That means the cells have no backup copies of their chromosomes. Remember that sporophytes are diploid. They have 2 copies of chromosomes in each cell. That means there is an extra copy if damage occurs. So because damage sometimes does occur to our DNA, we would generally prefer to spend our time in a diploid state. Indeed, humans do this, as do most animals. They are mostly in their diploid state, and it is for similar reasons. So let's talk a little bit about what seeds are. Seeds develop from ovules, and an ovule contains a small female gametophyte. So remember that a female gametophyte is going to be haploid and multicellular. Remember too that in the case of ovules, the nutrition for this gametophyte is going to come from the sporophyte. Finally, remember that gametophytes make eggs. So let's take a look over here and see what this means. This is an immature female cone from a pine, and this is the central axis. We can see what are developing into scales coming off on both sides. Then you can see at the very base of each scale this oval shape here and here and here, for example. That is where the ovule is. The ovule is a collection of cells in the gametophyte generation surrounded by some cells made by the sporophyte that are there to provide it nutrition. And remember, the gametophyte is haploid. It is going to make an egg by mitosis, and that egg will be haploid too. So about right here, there's presumably a haploid egg that has formed. That is going to need to be fertilized before it can become a zygote. So the way that the egg is going to get fertilized is from sperm, as has been the case for all of the other plants. But now the sperm is not free-swimming sperm. Instead, the sperm comes from pollen. So pollen is going to be our male gametophyte surrounded by a coat. It is going to get dispersed to the ovule, and when it does, then it is going to be able to grow and deliver sperm. When sperm is delivered, then the egg is going to be fertilized and become a zygote. At this point, the ovule and associated tissue with it are going to continue developing, and a coating is going to form around it, and this is going to become our seed. So the zygote that develops into an embryo is going to become part of the seed. Seeds have a seed coat, which is an outer protective layer around the seeds. Inside that coating, there are going to be a couple of things. There's going to be an embryo, which is a developing sporophyte, and it's going to have nutritional reserves. Rather, the seed is going to have nutritional reserves as well as the embryo, and these nutritional reserves are going to be used to feed the developing embryo. An embryo is diploid, and therefore it is part of the sporophyte generation. So what do seeds do? They do a few things. First, they allow for dispersal. This means that they allow new sporophytes to be transported away from the maternal plant. This is good for the maternal plant because if it were to form young plants directly under it, then those young plants would be in its shade and it would be competing for nutrients. So by allowing them to disperse further away, those new plants have a better chance of surviving. Seeds also allow for dormancy. What this means is that the sporophyte inside of the seed can survive in an inactive state when conditions are difficult. When would conditions be difficult? Well, for example, during the winter when it's cold, that might be a poor time to grow, or in some areas then during prolonged dry periods, that would be a poor time to grow. A dormant seed, because it's inactive, doesn't use up the resources inside the seed. So that seed can just wait until conditions are better, and then it can start growing. Finally, remember that seeds include nutrition. So they have both energy as well as substances that are necessary for that developing embryo to complete its development. This is going to allow the plants to survive before they ever start photosynthesis. So that's talking a little bit about seeds generally. Let's focus now on the gymnosperms. We said that gymnosperms are plants with cones. A cone is a modified determinate stem. And you can see here that it looks kind of like a stem. The ovule cone pictured on the right has a really thick central stem, but nevertheless it's a central axis with things coming off of it. And we already looked at this on the female cone. We saw that what was coming off of it are scales, and the scales have ovules sitting on them. Gymnosperms are called naked seeds because the ovule is not enclosed in anything. It is sitting on top of the scale. So that's going to be different than the angiosperms, where there's an entire layer that covers the entire ovule. Let's look over here on the left now at the pollen cone. The pollen cone also is a modified stem. You can see the central stem axis, and coming off of that are these sacs. And these sacs are going to contain cells that go through meiosis and make pollen. We've said that gymnosperms are cone plants. That, by extension, that means they do not make flowers. They make ovulate and pollen cones. We looked at immature ones on the last slide. So here's a reminder from earlier in the semester about what ovulate cones and pollen cones can look like. This is an ovulate cone from a pine cone, or from a pine rather, so it's a pine cone. And you can see those scales that were developing on the previous slide are now large and woody. And sitting on the surface of this, which we can't see clearly here, but at least initially there would have been a couple of seeds sitting on the surface of each of these scales. Because those seeds are not enclosed in something, that's why they're called naked or gymnosperms. Over on the right, we see a collection of a couple of dozen pollen cones, each one again with its central axis. And you can see all of these dark dots. Each one of those is going to be one of the places where there's a sac of pollen. The ovulate cones need to last for a while. For pines, it can take a couple of years from when the cone is formed to getting pollinated, to that pollen fertilizing the ovule and allowing that ovule to develop into a seed. So that takes time. The tree does not want the cone to break off before that process is complete, so it's going to make a sturdy cone. For pollen, all that has to happen is the pollen has to get made and released into the wind to disperse. So as a result, the pollen cones are nowhere near as sturdy. They're brittle, meaning that they can break, and they're ephemeral, meaning that they fall off pretty quickly. We said this earlier, but to emphasize, what is pollen? Pollen is a male gametophyte inside of a protective coat. And as a gametophyte, it must be a multicellular haploid generation. So why bother doing this? Why make pollen inside a coat rather than just making it and instead of making the gametophyte be free living like it was, let's say, with the ferns? Well, remember that the ovules that these are going to eventually get to fertilize are attached to the parent tree. So these need to get somehow from one tree over to where the ovule is on a different tree. And it can't do that by sitting on the ground and then making sperm like a fern would have done, because there's no way that sperm would be able to climb all the way up and reach the ovule high up on the tree. By putting the gametophyte inside the protective coat and then having a dispersal strategy, it is able to move from the plant that made it to another plant where it has a chance of fertilizing. Dispersal strategies are going to vary. In the gymnosperms, usually this strategy is wind. So the pollen, like the pine pollen, gets released into the wind and has some chance of blowing to a ovulate cone. You can see these two little Mickey Mouse ears. Those are air sacs to help the pine pollen float. And we'll talk about this in a later lecture, but some other kinds of pollen are going to be dispersed instead by insects. When the pollen does arrive at the female cone, then it's going to actually have to come out through the hard coating, and it's going to grow a tube of some shape that's going to deliver the sperm down to the egg. In some kinds of gymnosperms, that sperm still has tails because it is ancestrally related to plants where the sperm had to swim. In other kinds of gymnosperms, like the conifers, the tails are gone and the sperm are no longer capable of swimming. We are going to talk about some different groups of gymnosperms. We'll focus on 3 of them, Cycads, Ginkgos, and Conifers. There are one other group of some pretty weird species. Let's look at Cycads first. One is pictured here, and as you can see in the picture, the leaves look fern-like. They are pinnate with leaflets coming off on both sides. They make some unusual looking cones. Cycads mostly occur in the tropics. There are some common ones, but many are rare or endangered. And all parts of many cycads are toxic. including the leaves, including their reproductive structures, and including the pith of their stem. Remember, the pith is the center part. However, it is possible to remove the pith from a cycad and then leach away the toxins, and a starchy substance remains. That is eaten in some Asian cultures. Here we use cycads mostly for landscaping because they have a sort of dinosaur-y ancient look to them, and they can be a fun addition to a landscape. Because these are poisonous, they are often used as houseplants, but do make sure that if used as houseplants, that they are not in an area where they are likely to be eaten by a pet. The second group that we'll talk about are the ginkgos. And these are trees that, at this point in history, are only native to Eastern Asia, so China in particular. There's only one species in this entire group that's still alive, although we know that there used to be more species in ancient times. There would have been a lot of ginkgo trees in the period following the Carboniferous. So remember when we had the Cycad forests and the fern forests? It would be after that period that the ginkgos were pretty common, and then they became increasingly rare as the flowering plants instead took over. So we still have this one species, and it's an interesting species. It's got this fan-shaped leaf. It makes these things that look like fruits. We'll say that they're not technically fruits because only flowering plants can make fruits, but they are fleshy seeds or fleshy cones. And interesting trait about them is that when they are ripe, they smell kind of like vomit. So obviously that's not super desirable. Nevertheless, we often use ginkgos as common street trees. You can see that pictured here. We use them as street trees because they grow well in urban areas. They are able to withstand pollution. And because the female cones smell like vomit, we try to avoid them. We do that simply by planting male trees. And we're usually pretty good at this, but it's usually not too hard to find some mistakes out there and find ginkgo trees that are in fact female, and you'll find collections of cones on the ground underneath them. While the outside of the cone has the rank smell, the inside does not, and the inside is eaten in Asian cultures as usually a dessert type treat. It's eaten in small amounts because if you eat too much or eat it over too long of a time period, then it can become toxic and cause all sorts of problems. So it's better eaten just as a occasional treat. And this is an image of, I think, a Thai dish that involves ginkgo as well as coconut. The last group that we'll talk about are the conifers. Conifers are trees with needle-like or awl-like leaf shapes. So here's an example. This is juniper, and you can see the leaves are shaped sort of like awls, short but pointy. Most kinds of conifers are evergreen. This means that there's no season when all of the leaves fall off. It's not technically correct to say that the leaves never fall off. They do. It's just that all of the leaves on the branch don't fall off at the same time. Instead, one might fall off and then be replaced at the tip of the branch, and sometime later another one might fall off. So anytime you see this branch, there's always going to be some leaves on it. There's several groups that are included in the conifers. The one that we're most familiar with are the pine trees. Before we move on, let's point out on this image of juniper here, there are these things that look like berries. Again, we'll say that they cannot be true berries because berries are a kind of fruit, and only angiosperms make fruit. So technically these are fleshy cones, and we'll talk about what they're used for in a bit. Conifers can be very ancient and also huge. So some of our largest and oldest trees are conifers. One example are redwoods, which can reach 115 meters tall. That's 380 feet tall. The tallest trees around the USC Upstate campus are probably in the 80 to 100 foot range as an estimate. So if you picture those trees and then picture trees that are almost 4 times taller, that's as tall as a redwood tree. So gargantuan. Trees can be 12 meters across. That's wide enough that you can cut out the middle and have cars drive through. It's 38 feet across. We're talking the size of a classroom. Some gymnosperm trees are also incredibly old. Here's an example of a bristlecone pine tree, and bristlecone pine trees can live more than 5,000 years. So if you imagine what was happening in history 2,000 years ago, double that, and then you're still not back to the point where some of these trees started growing. Conifers are super important to humans. We use conifers like pines to make paper, and so that's a big industry in parts of South Carolina and neighboring areas, especially down around the South Carolina-Georgia border. We use conifers for lumber. Remember that conifers are softwood because they don't have fibers in their xylem, and it's common as construction material, let's say for houses. If you go buy a 2x4 at Home Depot, that's going to be pine, and so that is conifer. We use conifers a little bit for food. So I showed you that image of pine nuts at the beginning of the lecture. If you're a fan of pesto or other Italian cooking, then there are things where pine nuts are added. We use juniper berries, so they're not true berries, I put it in quotes, but I showed you the image of them and they looked like berries. We use those as the flavoring for gin. On a day-to-day basis, the place where we'll encounter conifers the most is in landscaping. They're useful landscaping trees because they do not lose their leaves, and so if there's somewhere where you want a barricade, a visual barricade or a sound barricade that lasts the entire year, then a conifer is a good choice. So some final thoughts about seeds and conifers. Starting with seeds, I just want to emphasize that the transition from a dominant to a dominant sporophyte generation, which we've seen in the seeds, is one of the most important events in the history of plants. Going from a gametophyte, like in the charophytes, all the way up to a point where the plants are spending most of their time as a diploid sporophyte, has allowed plants to be successful, or be more successful than they would be otherwise. Seeds are an important new structure. We already said that they allow plants to disperse more effectively, and they allow plants to stay dormant. This is part of why seed plants are the majority of what we find now on terrestrial environments, rather than ferns or lycophytes. Seeds are also incredibly important to humans as our food source. So all of the grains are really kinds of seeds. If you're eating corn or wheat or rice, or things made from seeds like flour and bread, then really you're eating seeds. So without seeds, most of our diet would go away. Focusing on the gymnosperms, pines are super important and common in South Carolina. About half of the forested land in the state is pine, and forestry, focusing largely on those pines, is a multi-billion-dollar industry in the state. So they are important.